Let your breathing slow. There is no urgency here, no clock pressing its cold face against the night. Whatever the day demanded of you, it has taken its portion and gone. What remains is this quiet, and the long, soft corridor of time opening before you now. 12,000 years of it, at least, stretching back through fog and fire and ice to a world so different from our own that it seems, at moments, to belong to a separate planet entirely. You do not need to follow every thread. You do not need to remember every name. Simply let the voice carry you, the way a river carries a leaf, gently and without any effort on the leaf's part at all. We are going somewhere tonight, somewhere old. And the story we are tracing has its roots in a city that no longer exists, in a bloodline that nearly died with it, in a boy who grew up thinking he was no one, and who turned out in the slow unfolding of history to be the most dangerous secret the world had ever kept. Begin then, at the beginning, or as close to a beginning as we can reach with any confidence. There was once a peninsula on the eastern continent, far across the narrow sea from everything the story of Westeros concerns itself with, and that peninsula was called the Valyrian Freehold. It rose over many centuries into something history has no precise word for, not quite an empire in the Roman sense, not quite a theocracy, not quite a republic, but some strange, shimmering fusion of all three, held together by a force that most of the world had never seen and would never see again: dragons. The dragon lords of Valyria did not simply ride their creatures. They bonded with them in a manner that went deeper than language can easily reach. Something passed through blood and breath, and the particular quality of attention that exists between two living things who have chosen each other across the barrier of species. The dragons were not weapons. Or they were weapons, yes, but the way the sea is a weapon, something vast and pre-existing, something that could be worked with if you understood its nature but never truly tamed. The Valyrian dragon lords built their freehold on the bones of the Giscari Empire, which they broke and scattered the way a stone breaks ice on a winter pond, cleanly, without ceremony, with a kind of casual thoroughness that speaks less to cruelty than to the simple arithmetic of power. They wrote their history in High Valyrian, a language so precise and so beautiful that it survived the destruction of everything that produced it, persisting in fragments of poetry and prophecy and Maester's scholarship for centuries after the city itself was gone. They practiced a form of endogamy, marriage within family lines, often between siblings, that their Maesters and their enemies alike called incestuous, but that the dragon lords themselves understood as something different, as the preservation of a gift. The gift was the dragon bond. And the dragon bond, they believed, ran in the blood like silver and gold threads through dark cloth, and could be diluted, attenuated, eventually lost altogether if the bloodline was permitted to wander too far from itself. It is worth pausing on that thought for a moment. Sit with the strangeness of it. A civilization powerful enough to shatter empires, sophisticated enough to build roads that still stand, producing poetry still studied 1,000 years after its destruction, and the organizing principle of its aristocracy was the preservation of a biological trait that allowed certain families to bond with creatures of fire and flight. Everything else was secondary to that. The art, the scholarship, the infrastructure, the philosophy, these were ornaments. The dragon bond was the thing itself, and so the great families of Valyria folded in upon themselves, generation after generation, century after century, preserving the silver hair and the violet eyes and the particular quality of the blood that let their children stand in fire and emerge unburned, that let them look into a dragon's enormous ancient gaze and be recognized rather than consumed. 400 years before the events the world knows as the War of the Five Kings, a branch of one of these dragonlord families took a peculiar step. They left, not because they were exiled, not because they had fallen in the hierarchies of the freehold, but because a young woman named Dennis, called the Dreamer by those who came after, had a vision she could not dismiss, a dream of fire and ruin and the sea rising to swallow stone, and she was frightened enough, and her father trusted her enough, that the entire family packed their lives onto ships and sailed west to a cold and windswept island called Dragonstone, perched at the edge of the narrow sea like a stone fist raised against the horizon. 12 years later, everything Daenerys had dreamed of came to pass. The Valyrian Freehold was destroyed in a single cataclysm. Volcanoes, most scholars believe, though the specifics have been lost in the same fire that consumed the records. The Doom of Valyria it is called, and the name carries its own weight, brief, final, unarguable. The family that survived was the Targaryens. They arrived in Westeros not as refugees seeking charity, but as conquerors who had lost nothing essential, who still had their dragons, who still had their blood, who still carried in their veins whatever it was that Valyria had spent centuries trying to preserve. They waited on Dragonstone for 100 years after the Doom, gathering themselves, watching the Seven Kingdoms bicker and bleed on the continent across the water, and then Aegon the Conqueror and his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys descended on Westeros with 3 dragons and changed everything so completely that the calendar was reset to account for their arrival. Everything before them became before the conquest. Everything after became after the conquest. This is what a Targaryen is. This is the weight of the blood. Not simply a claim to a throne, not simply a family name attached to a dynasty that has since fallen, but the inheritor of everything Valyria preserved for centuries at extraordinary cost, and the vessel of a power that the world has seen only once and never forgotten. Jon Snow did not know any of this. He grew up in Winterfell believing himself the bastard son of Eddard Stark, and the name he was given, Snow, the traditional surname for baseborn children in the north, was a quiet, persistent reminder of his ambiguity, his lack of place, his standing just outside the circle of legitimate belonging. He grew up beside Robb Stark, who would be a lord and then a king. He grew up in the shadow of Lady Catelyn Stark's barely concealed distaste, which was not cruelty precisely, but something worse, a constant, polite, visible wish that he had not existed. He was tolerated. He was loved by his Lord Father, quietly and without demonstration, the way a man loves something he is also ashamed of, and none of it, not a single moment of that boyhood spent in draughty halls, eating at the far end of the high table, sharpening a sword he would eventually carry north beyond the wall, none of it touched the thing that was actually true about him. The thing that was actually true about him was this. He was not Eddard Stark's son at all. He was Aegon Targaryen, named in secret for the Conqueror himself, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, born in a tower in Dorne at the tail end of Robert's rebellion, in the last hours of a war that had been fought, in part over the question of whether his parents' love was a kidnapping or a choice. His mother died giving him life. His father had been killed months before, killed by the man who would take the Iron Throne, killed with a warhammer on the banks of the Trident in a battle so decisive it ended an era. And so Jon entered the world without parents, without a name that anyone would speak aloud, without a place in any story he could be allowed to know. Eddard Stark took him home as a secret and a grief, and the secret held for nearly 20 years, and the Targaryen blood ran quiet and cold as an underground river through a body that believed itself to be nothing more than a Stark bastard with no particular destiny. This is the inheritance he carried without knowing he carried it. Not simply a throne, though the throne follows from it, if you trace the line of succession with honesty. Not simply a name, though names matter enormously in a world where lineage is the architecture of power. What he carried was the accumulated intention of centuries of Valyrian preservation, the bond that was bred into the blood across generations, the particular quality of being that made certain people capable of standing in fire, of being recognized by creatures that burned everything else. He carried it as unconsciously as a man carries his heartbeat. And the world around him, the world that had spent its energies rebuilding itself after the Targaryens fell, the world of Lannisters and Baratheons and Tyrells and all the rest, who had made their peace with the idea that the Dragon Lords were done, had absolutely no idea what was sleeping in the snow. Let that settle around you now, like the darkness settling in a room after a candle is blown out. There is nothing you need to grasp or hold. The history will keep. The blood will keep. And somewhere north, in a cold that has no interest in dynasties or bloodlines or the politics of inheritance, a young man is pulling on his black cloak for the first time, taking his vows beside a dying fire, speaking the words of the Night's Watch into the dark without the faintest notion that he's also speaking them over a secret that could unmake the world as it currently stands. Rest now. The story will continue when you wake. And the story, like all old things, has infinite patience. There is something particular about the way a secret operates when the secret is a person. An ordinary secret, a letter hidden, a decision concealed, an action misreported. exists in a specific place, can be retrieved or destroyed, has edges and weight, and the quality of something that can be managed. A secret that walks around, that breathes, that grows taller each year, that makes friends and enemies and learns to fight with a sword, and looks people in the eye with grey, stark eyes that contain, somewhere behind them, an inheritance that could overturn the entire current arrangement of the world. This kind of secret has its own momentum. It exceeds the intentions of the people who created it. It develops in directions that could not be anticipated. Eddard Stark did not foresee Castle Black. He could not have. He was trying to keep his nephew alive until there was enough safety in the world to allow the truth to be told. But the world never reached that state of safety during his lifetime, and when he died with the secret intact, the secret became something that had to manage itself. The Targaryen dynasty lasted nearly 300 years on the Iron Throne. 3 centuries of silver-haired, violet-eyed kings and queens, of dragons both living and dead, of the particular quality of political order that a family with fire-breathing creatures can maintain, a quality that involves a good deal of negotiation and a good deal less negotiation than it would otherwise require. They were not uniformly wise or uniformly cruel or uniformly anything, because 3 centuries is long enough to produce every possible variation on a human theme. There were the great ones, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, who built the King's Road and presided over the longest peace the continent had known, and whose court attracted the finest minds of the age, Aegon the Unlikely, who had not expected to be king, and whose surprise at finding himself so made him more careful with the position than those who had expected it from birth. And there were the failures, the Maekar who was brittle, the Aerion who was genuinely dangerous, the long list of those who allowed the particular quality of Targaryen certainty to curdle into something that hurt the people around them. Aerys II, the Mad King, Jon's paternal grandfather, represents the endpoint of a particular family pathology. The inbreeding that Valyrian tradition required for the preservation of the dragon bond also produced, with the statistical reliability of any practice that narrows a gene pool over sufficient time, individuals in whom the line between brilliance and instability was extremely thin and often crossed. Aerys was not always what he became. There is testimony from people who knew him young that he was charming, clever, genuinely gifted, the kind of king who could have been, under different pressures, one of the good ones. What the pressures did to him is a medical and historical question the story does not fully resolve, but the result is clear. A king who heard whispers everywhere, who trusted no one, who surrounded himself with wildfire, the alchemist's green flame, the artificial dragonfire, as a substitute for the actual dragons that had been extinct for over a century by the time of his reign. Rhaegar grew up watching this. Rhaegar grew up the son of a man deteriorating into paranoia and flame obsession, and it made him careful, and it made him quiet, and it may have intensified the urgency of his relationship to the prophecy. Because if the dragons were gone, and the king was becoming something monstrous, then the salvation the prophecy promised could not come from the dynasty as it currently stood. It would have to come from somewhere else, from something new, from a child who had not yet been born. Breathe gently. You're still here, still held by the dark, still wrapped in whatever warmth surrounds you. There is no distance between you and this moment. The pillow, the weight of the blanket, the particular quality of silence that belongs to your room at this hour. Let that in, and let the story in alongside it, moving quietly, the way cold air moves through a gap under a door, not intruding, just present, just threading itself into the room without asking permission. We are going somewhere older tonight, somewhere that smells of books and candle wax and the particular anxiety of a brilliant man who has made himself responsible for saving the world. His name is Rhaegar Targaryen, and the shadow he cast reached forward through time so far that it produced, in the end, a life he never held, a child he named with a dead king's name, a prophecy he staked everything on, and which his son would have to carry without ever being told he was carrying it. Rhaegar Targaryen was, by all accounts that survive him, one of the most gifted men of his generation. This is not the ordinary flattery that attaches itself to princes after their deaths, when reputation becomes a currency spent by partisans. The accounts come from people who had no reason to be generous. Robert Baratheon, who killed him and spent a decade trying to erase his memory, nonetheless conceded, when pressed and when drunk, that Rhaegar had been formidable. Barristan Selmy, who served faithfully in the Kingsguard and whose honesty was the most consistent thing about him, loved Rhaegar with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who has identified another man as the finest version of what a man can be. Even Ned Stark, who had reasons both political and personal to despise the prince, described him with something that sounds, between the lines, like reluctant admiration. He was good at everything a prince was supposed to be good at: the sword, the harp, the management of men's loyalty. But Rhaegar was not, at his core, a man of action or politics. He was a scholar. He had the Targaryen look, the silver hair, the pale, luminous skin, the violet eyes that unsettled people who had not grown up around them, and inside that exterior was a mind that had spent its formative years in the libraries of Dragonstone, working through scrolls and codices with the focused intensity of someone who had decided that books were more important than courts. His particular obsession arrived at around the age of 10 or 11, when he read something in an old scroll that frightened him badly enough to immediately take up the sword. His obsession was prophecy. Specifically, the prophecy of the prince that was promised, and the long night it was meant to prevent. The long night. Sit with that phrase for a moment before we move past it. A night that lasted a generation. A darkness so complete that crops failed and people starved, and the cold became something the living did not survive, and the dead rose in it, and the creatures that drove the dead southward were things that had perhaps once been men, or perhaps had never been men at all, cold and silent and possessed of an intelligence that wanted nothing except the end of warmth. This was the long night. It had happened once, approximately 8,000 years before Rhaegar sat reading in his library, and the memory of it had been preserved in the form of the Wall, that vast 700-foot structure of ice and ancient magic that stretches from coast to coast across the northern reaches of the continent, built, according to legend, by Bran the Builder, a figure so old he belongs more to myth than to history, but whose work was real enough that it still stands. The wall was not built to keep out wildlings. The wall was built to keep out what lives beyond it, in the cold, in the dark, in the place where the long night was born. Rhaegar read all of this. He read the warnings embedded in the ancient texts about the patterns of the seasons. The world of ice and fire is a world where summers and winters do not follow predictable rhythms, where a summer can last years and a winter can outlast a generation, and the maesters who tracked these patterns had noted, with the careful anxiety of men who understand statistics but not what to do about them, that the cold was coming again. That the winter building in the north had a quality different from ordinary winters. Rhaegar put all of this together, the prophecy, the seasons, the old stories about the others, the accounts of the wall and what it was for, and arrived at a conclusion that most people would have found insane, and that he found simply urgent. The long night was going to happen again, within his lifetime or his children's lifetimes. And the prophecy said there would be a prince, born of the blood of the dragon, born amid salt and smoke, carrying a sword called Lightbringer, who would stand against the darkness and either win or lose everything on behalf of all living things. He believed for a significant portion of his adult life that he was this prince. He believed it not from vanity, or not primarily from vanity, but from the evidence of his own reading, his own reasoning, his own careful accumulation of historical inference. He had been born during a terrible storm that had destroyed the fleet in the harbour at Dragonstone, which he took for salt, and fire was all around him always, the fire in which Targaryens are born and which they carry in their blood. He was the right blood, the right era, the right place, and so he tried, with the instruments available to him, his sword arm, his political influence, his attempts to be the best version of himself, to become what the prophecy needed him to be. But then something shifted. The records do not preserve the exact moment, the exact text, the exact reasoning. What they preserve is the outcome. Rhaegar revised his interpretation. Somewhere in his late 20s, sometime around the period when his marriage to Elia Martell had produced 2 children, Rhaenys and Aegon, he came to believe that the prince that was promised was not him, was not meant to be him, that the prophecy spoke of someone else, someone not yet born, someone whose existence depended on a very specific set of circumstances that had not yet been arranged. The prophecy, as he now understood it, spoke of a dragon with 3 heads, and Elia Martell, whose health had been compromised by her previous pregnancies, could not safely carry another child. She'd given him 2. The third, the necessary third, would have to come from somewhere else. This is the decision that changed everything. Not the decision to pursue Lyanna Stark. That is what followed, and it carries its own weight and its own tragedy. The decision that changed everything was smaller and more intimate than any political act. It was a man, alone with his books and his certainty, deciding that the fate of the world required a specific child to be born, and that he was the one who needed to create that child. He was not a monster. This needs to be said because the story that followed, Robert's rebellion, the sack of King's Landing, the deaths, the decade of war that reshaped the entire political geography of Westeros, could make him appear monstrous in retrospect. He was a man who loved too completely, believed too absolutely, and had been given, by the accident of his birth and his education, just enough information to feel certain, and not quite enough information to be right in all the ways that mattered. The child he was trying to create, the third head of the dragon, the prince born of a specific blood combination that he had worked out from the texts, the child who would carry both the fire of the Targaryens and something else, something northern and old and connected to the deep magic of the continent itself. That child was eventually born, in a tower in Dorne, in a room that smelled of blood and sweat, and the herbs Ned Stark's companions brought too late. His mother named him with her dying breath, and the name she chose was one her brother promised to keep secret, a promise he kept for the rest of his life at enormous personal cost. And here is where the modern echo becomes unavoidable. Jon Snow riding north to take the Black, kneeling in the cold to speak his vows, learning to lead from behind a wall he thought was a posting rather than a purpose. Jon Snow was the answer to Rhaegar's question. He was the conclusion of Rhaegar's equation. He had been constructed, in a sense that is both intimate and cosmic, by a man who spent his life reading books and became convinced he understood what the world needed. He was the prophecy that his father made real through an act of faith so enormous it destroyed a dynasty and killed a king and set 2 continents of politics into motion for a decade. And he did not know. He knelt in the snow and spoke his vows and did not know that the vows he was really taking were older than the Night's Watch, older than the Wall, older than the dynasty he had no idea he'd been born into. Rest with that. Let the weight of it settle. Your breathing is slow. The night is long and kind. And the story is patient. The harp deserves a moment of attention because the harp is not incidental to who Rhaegar was. It is in fact the most revealing thing about him, more revealing than the sword, more revealing than the scholarship, more revealing than the silver hair and the violet eyes and the formal gravity of his public bearing. He played in the streets of King's Landing, it is said, and people wept. This is the kind of anecdote that biography tends to embellish into sentiment, but the consistency with which it appears across accounts that otherwise disagree on matters of Rhaegar's character suggests that it contains something real. He was not performing sorrow when he played. He was performing what he felt, which was a quality of longing so specific that it had found its instrument in music, the longing of someone who understood what the world was moving toward and could not find the words, in any of the languages available to him, to make others understand it too. The prophecy of the prince that was promised exists in at least 3 textual traditions, and the relationship between them is exactly as vexed as the relationship between any ancient texts that have been copied and commented upon and interpreted and reinterpreted across 1,000 years of changing political and theological context. The oldest version is in High Valyrian, and carries with it the problem inherent in High Valyrian's grammatical structure. The language uses a single form for both the masculine and feminine pronoun in the third person, when speaking of cosmic or prophetic subjects, which means that every translation that renders the promised prince as specifically male is making an editorial decision that the original text does not require. Rhaegar knew this. He was a scholar. He worked in the original language. And yet he continued to think of the prophecy as pointing toward a son rather than a daughter, perhaps because he was a man of his time and certain assumptions felt like grammar rather than bias. Master Aemon, who is perhaps the most tragic figure in a story full of tragic figures, knew about the prophecy. He knew it the way very few people alive in the age of the main narrative knew it. From the inside, as someone who had spent a long life in scholarly engagement with the texts. He was the last Targaryen on the wall, and the years of the main story arrived too late for him, and he died before the truth about Jon Snow was established. But in his final days he said something that the story treats as more than delirium, that he had been wrong, that he had misidentified the promised champion the way everyone had misidentified it, that the answer had been in front of him for years and he had not seen it. He was travelling with Daenerys' fleet, or trying to reach Daenerys, and his mind was going. But the thought he kept returning to, even as lucidity left him, was the thought of a mistake corrected too late, the thought of looking at the wrong face for too long, while the right face was somewhere else entirely, doing something else, becoming what it was always going to become without his help or anyone's. There is nothing required of you right now, nothing at all. Let the tension in your shoulders release, and let the breath come in slowly and leave slowly, and let the quality of your attention soften from grip to drift. We are going back now to a very specific place and a very specific moment, a tower in the mountains of Dorne, a place called the Tower of Joy, which is a name so incongruous with what happened inside it that it seems almost like a cruelty, the way the softest names are sometimes attached to the hardest things. But names in the world we're tracing carry their own logic, their own buried poetry, and even this one, Joy, of all words, contains something true if you look at it from the right angle, which is not the angle of war or politics, but the angle of two people who chose each other in the face of everything the world was arrayed against them. We will look at it from that angle tonight. And from the angle of a woman who understood something her brother never did, and whose last request was a secret that changed the shape of history. Dorne is the southernmost kingdom of Westeros, separated from the rest of the continent by the Red Mountains and by centuries of cultural distinction that made it, in many respects, more different from the north than any 2 points on the same landmass have a right to be. Where the north is cold and spare and laconic, Dorne is hot and elaborate and generous with feeling. It produces a different kind of person, more likely to speak passion aloud, less likely to suffer indignity in silence, possessed of a relationship to honour that emphasises personal satisfaction over social expectation in ways that the chivalric north would find at best foreign and at worst dishonourable. It was where Rhaegar Targaryen chose to go when the political situation in King's Landing became unbearable to him, when his father's madness was accelerating, when the Kingsguard had been given over to men he did not fully trust, when the road ahead seemed to require a kind of patience he was not sure he had. And it was in Dorne that he met Lyanna Stark again, or met her properly for the first time, in the sense that the context allowed them to see each other without the intermediary of family obligation and political arrangement. Lyanna Stark of Winterfell, who was already betrothed to Robert Baratheon, who was described by everyone who knew her as possessed of a wildness and a directness that made her more like her brother Ned in temperament than the soft and manageable girl a betrothal to a great lord was supposed to produce. She could ride. She had a ferocity that people called wolfish in the Stark way, and meant it as both warning and compliment. She was not afraid of Rhaegar Targaryen. This distinction mattered. Many people were afraid of Rhaegar, not because he was cruel, but because he was certain, and certainty in a powerful man has its own gravitational field. What passed between them is one of the great unresolved questions of the age, and the story has been told in two versions so contradictory that they constitute almost separate realities. In the version Robert Baratheon told himself for the rest of his life, Rhaegar was a monster who stole an innocent girl and kept her prisoner, and the war fought to reclaim her was a war of justice. In the version that Ned Stark preserved in his most private grief, and that the evidence of a tower in Dorne strongly suggests, Lyanna was not a prisoner. She had chosen. She had chosen Rhaegar, knowing what it would cost: the betrothal to Robert, the political stability of her family, the peace of the continent, and she had gone with him not against her will, but in accordance with it, which is the hardest kind of choice because it is the kind you cannot be rescued from. The Tower of Joy was named by someone at some point, and the name did not emerge from tragedy. It emerged from whatever was true inside those walls before the war caught up with them. It is worth sitting with the question of what Lyanna knew and when she knew it. She was not a scholar. She had not, as far as the record suggests, spent years in libraries reading about the prince that was promised. But she was with Rhaegar for approximately a year, and Rhaegar was a man who could not help explaining himself, who carried his obsessions as visibly as other men carry weapons. She knew why he had done what he had done. She knew the prophecy, or enough of it. She knew that the child she was carrying was, in Rhaegar's understanding, the answer to a question the world did not yet know it was asking. And she knew, as her health failed in the heat of a Dornish summer, as the birth became something she was not going to survive, that the answer to the question would have no protection at all once she was gone. Because here is what Lyanna saw with a clarity that the war being fought in her name had obscured entirely. If this child was known to be Rhaegar's son, he was dead. The Lannisters had already moved. Gregor Clegane had already entered the nurseries at the Red Keep, and done what large men with no conscience do when powerful lords require that a line be erased. Elia Martell's children, Rhaenys, Aegon, were dead. Dead not in battle, not with any ceremony, but with the specific methodical thoroughness of men exterminating a claim. If this baby arrived into the world carrying the Targaryen name, he arrived into the crosshairs of everything Robert Baratheon was about to become. Robert, who loved Lyanna desperately and obsessively, and in a way that was more possession than partnership, would not extend mercy to Rhaegar's son. The mere fact of the child's existence would be intolerable to him. And Lyanna was dying. The bed was soaked, the room was hot, the servants she had were doing what they could, and it was not enough. Ned Stark arrived with the companions who had fought through the Kingsguard at the base of the tower. 3 of the 7, the finest fighters in the world, who had died rather than move from a post they had been given by a prince who was already dead. And he found his sister not imprisoned, not rescued, but leaving, going somewhere he could not follow, and she asked him, before she went, for a promise. The word promise in what survives of this conversation carries the same weight the word always carries in the world we are exploring. It is an absolute, a thing you cannot qualify or revisit, a thing that becomes part of you once you have spoken it. She asked him to take the baby and claim it as his own, to give it a bastard's name and a bastard's place, and let it grow up invisible, as close to nothing as a living person can get, because invisible was the only kind of safe there was. And Ned Stark, who had fought a war and watched his best friend grow into something that frightened him, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone alive at that moment, exactly what Robert was capable of. Ned Stark said yes. He carried the promise home with him like a wound that never healed. He carried it in Catelyn's distrust and in the careful distance he maintained from the question every time Robert drank too much and started talking about Targaryens. He carried it so completely that it killed him in the end, because the same quality of absolute adherence to principle that made Ned Stark say yes to his dying sister's request was the quality that made him incapable of playing the Game of Thrones the way it needed to be played. What Lyanna had done, in her last minutes, was make a decision that she could only barely enforce, a decision that depended entirely on the honour of one man, that could be unmade by a single loose word in the wrong company, that required a conspiracy of silence maintained across decades with no institutional support and no possibility of explanation. She had looked at the situation, and she had understood something the entire war had failed to understand, that the most dangerous place for this child was at the centre of history, that the only way to protect the prophecy, to protect the answer, to protect whatever Rhaegar had believed the world would need, was to make it disappear, was to bury it under a false name in the cold north and hope the cold kept the secret until the secret was no longer needed. She was right, and she was also, in a way that she could not have foreseen, condemning her son to a particular kind of loneliness that goes beyond ordinary bastard loneliness into something more fundamental, the loneliness of being separated from your own story. Jon Snow grew up haunted by a question he could not answer. Who was his mother, and what had she been to his father, and why did Eddard Stark's face close like a door every time the subject was approached? He grew up with that wound, and it shaped him, and it sent him north, and it gave him a particular quality of sympathy for people who did not belong anywhere, which is its own kind of preparation for the role the world had in mind for him, even if the world had not yet found the language to say so. Sleep now. The tower is quiet, the story holds its breath, and the stars above Dorne are cold and very far away. The 3 Kingsguard at the base of the Tower of Joy, Sir Arthur Dayne, Sir Oswell Went, and Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, represent one of the great mysteries of the age. They were the finest fighters in the world, or close to it, Arthur Dane especially, who bore the greatsword Dorne, a blade made from the heart of a fallen star, kept by the Dane family of Starfall for generations, given only to a knight worthy of the title Sword of the Morning, was considered by people who thought carefully about such things to be possibly the finest swordsman of his generation. They had not been at the Trident with Rhaegar when he died. They had not been at King's Landing when the sack occurred. They were here in Dorne at this tower, and they died here, against Ned Stark and the 6 companions who rode with him, and only 2 people survived the encounter, Ned Stark and Howland Reed. Howland Reed has never told anyone what happened. Not formally, not on any account that has entered the public record. He knows, and he keeps the knowing the way Ned kept the promise, absolutely without drama, as a fact that belongs to the people who were there and no one else. What they were guarding is the question. Not Lyanna, she was not a prisoner, and the word guarding implies a coercive relationship that the evidence does not support. They were fulfilling a function, maintaining a post, executing an instruction that Rhaegar had given them before he rode north to die. The instruction, extrapolated from everything we know about Rhaegar's state of mind and the architecture of what he was trying to create, was this: protect the child that was not yet born when he gave the instruction, the child that he believed the world would need, the child whose existence he was trying to ensure by all the means available to him. The finest swordsmen in the world were stationed at the base of that tower, not to imprison anyone, but to make certain that what was inside the tower survived long enough to enter the world. This means that when Ned Stark's companions died fighting through them, they died fighting men who were doing their duty. Not the duty of evil, but the duty of conviction, the duty of loyalty to an instruction from a prince they loved, who had given them what he believed was the most important assignment in the history of the world. And when Ned Stark climbed the stairs and found his sister, and took the baby from the room, he was completing, without knowing he was completing it, the protective function those men had died to establish. The Kingsguard fell so that the child could be carried out, and Ned Stark carried the child out and went home with it, and spent 20 years and his life and his reputation maintaining the next layer of protection. Not steel, but silence. Not weapons, but the particular valour of a man who will bear any misunderstanding, rather than allow the truth to be spoken into an environment where the truth is a death sentence. If you are still awake, that is perfectly fine. There is no performance required here, no destination you have failed to reach. The dark is patient, the night is long. Let your body be heavy, let the mattress hold you with its quiet insistence, and let the voice be simply a thread you follow with the loosest possible grip. We're going north now, further north than castles and courts and the comfortable machinery of civilization. We're going to the edge of what the map acknowledges, to a structure that stands at the border between the world as it is currently understood and the world as it was. Once before, men forgot what they had built and why. We are going to the Wall, and we're going to think about what it means to send someone there. Not as a posting, not as an honour, but as a kind of erasure. The Night's Watch, which presents itself as the most ancient and noble of institutions, is also, viewed from a certain angle, a machine for removing inconvenient people from the world of the living. The Wall is 700 feet tall, which is a number that sounds like an exaggeration, until you stand at the base of it and understand that it is not. It stretches 300 miles from the shivering sea in the east to the Bay of Ice in the west, a structure of such enormous ambition that no modern builder would attempt it even with the engineering tools centuries of accumulated knowledge provide. The ice of which it is made is not ordinary ice. It has been compacted and worked over millennia into something with a different texture, a different quality, a density that no winter storm has managed to overcome in 8,000 years of trying. And within the ice, or woven through it in a manner that the builders understood and that the current age has mostly forgotten, is something else. Magic, old and cold and functional in the way that the deepest functional things are, quietly, without advertisement, the way gravity is functional, always operating, never demonstrating. The Night's Watch was created to man the Wall, to stand at the top of it and watch the north, and if the north produced what it had once produced, the others, the whites, the long night made ambulatory and purposeful, to hold the line until the rest of the world could be warned. It is the oldest military order in Westeros, older than the Seven Kingdoms, older than the faith of the Seven, older than almost every institution the current civilization considers foundational. Its members take vows that are absolute in the manner of the most serious promises. No wife, no children, no lands, no titles, no participation in the inheritance schemes and marriage alliances that constitute the normal business of Westerosi political life. They take black, and they keep it until they die, which has always been the kind of arrangement that attracts men with nothing left to lose. By the time Jon Snow arrives, the Night's Watch has been decaying for generations. The Long Night is a memory preserved in stories most people take as metaphor rather than history. The wildlings beyond the wall are understood as the real threat, which is to say, a threat proportional to the forces currently available, manageable, familiar, the kind of enemy you can fight with swords and tactics rather than with whatever it was that built the wall in the first place. The Watch's numbers are down. Its recruits are largely men who chose black over execution, which produces a particular social atmosphere. Not entirely without honour, not entirely without competence, but carrying the specific difficulty of a community assembled primarily from people whose previous options were unappealing. Castle Black, the largest of the remaining manned castles along the wall, is cold and understaffed, and operating on an institutional memory that has been diluted by centuries of peacetime administration. Jon Snow comes to this place at 14, or close to it, with the particular combination of privilege and wound that makes him both equipped and unsuited for what he finds. He is equipped because Eddard Stark's household gave him an education that most Night's Watch recruits cannot dream of. He can read, he can fight with technique rather than just aggression. He has been exposed to the management of men and the culture of command from the inside. He is unsuited because he still carries, in his bearing and his expectations, the residue of growing up in a great lord's hall, and the other recruits can feel it, and it produces exactly the friction that institutional humility is designed to resolve. The first lessons Castle Black teaches him are lessons in scale. He's not special here, not yet, not in the ways he was used to mattering. What no one says aloud, but what the structure of his situation makes visible, Jon Snow has been sent away. Not with malice. Eddard Stark loved him, in his constrained and secret-bearing way. But the world of Westeros as it was then constituted had no place for him. A bastard of Eddard Stark's would always be a problem, a visible testament to whatever it was the Lord of Winterfell had done in the war that produced him, a sore spot in a marriage that was politically necessary and personally complicated. The Night's Watch was the cleanest resolution available. It removed him from the calculus of Stark succession, removed him from the marriage market, removed him from any future in which he might cause complications simply by existing near the legitimate heirs. It was a kind one-way door. You walk through it, and the world you came from is closed behind you. The cruelty of this, if cruelty is even the right word for something done with love, is that the thing being unmade was not Jon Snow the bastard. The Night's Watch did not know what it was receiving when it swore Jon Snow to its service. It was receiving a Targaryen. It was receiving the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne, more legitimate than Robert had ever been, more legitimate than Joffrey, more legitimate than anyone currently in the competition for power, because Jon's claim ran through both Targaryen blood and a secret marriage that made him not a bastard at all but a prince. The institution that was supposed to erase him from the Game of Thrones was accidentally housing the person with the most compelling possible reason to be at the centre of it. If the story were simple, this is where it would resolve. Someone would discover the truth, the documents would be produced, the succession would assert itself. But the story is not simple. The Night's Watch had taken his identity, or the identity it knew him by, and replaced it with black. The vows are absolute. A man of the Night's Watch who abandons his post is a deserter, and the penalty has always been death. The same death that Eddard Stark rode out to enforce in the very first pages of his story on a man who had seen something in the north that terrified him badly enough to run. Jon Snow was bound, and the binding was in some ways the most dangerous thing about him, not his blood, but his character. He was the kind of man who kept his vows, and the vow he had taken in the cold beside a dying fire was one that constrained everything else, even when everything else turned out to matter enormously. If the stories we are exploring have spoken to you tonight, if you have found something here worth returning to, this is a good moment to rest your hand near where you keep your devices and consider subscribing, so the next journey is waiting when you wake. There is no urgency in it, just a small gesture in the direction of more stories, more history, more long quiet hours like this one, when the world shrinks to the size of a voice in the dark and the darkness is nothing to be afraid of. The stars above the wall are different from the stars anywhere else. There are more of them, visible at this latitude without the interference of torchlight or the glow of a city, and they are cold and clear and very ancient, and they do not care about vows or bloodlines or the particular ironies of institutional erasure. They simply persist. They were there before the wall, and they will be there after. And Jon Snow, standing his watch in the cold, is learning something that the comfortable and powerful never learn, what it feels like to be small in the presence of something enormous, and to stand your ground anyway. That is, in the end, the most dangerous quality a person can develop. And he is developing it in exactly the place the world sent him to be forgotten. Sleep well. The watch continues without you. The recruits who come to the wall with Jon Snow in the first season of their Black are, in their way, a cross-section of everything the Night's Watch has become. Men who chose this over worse alternatives, carrying specific histories that the vows are supposed to supersede, and that human nature ensures they do not supersede entirely. Gren is simple and earnest, and becomes, in the way of simple and earnest people, a kind of anchor. Pip has a quick mind, and a performer's instinct for survival. Samwell Tarly arrives as something that the institutional culture of the Watch does not know what to do with. A man who is absolutely terrified, physically unsuited to combat, and possessed of an intelligence so thorough and a memory so reliable that he will eventually become the most important scholarly resource the Watch has access to, in the moment that the Watch needs scholarly resources most. Jon Snow does not initially understand why Sam matters. He learns. The learning is part of his education in a kind of leadership that the training he received in Winterfell did not cover. The leadership of people who are not like you, in conditions that do not reward the things you were trained to value. Jorah Mormont, the Old Bear, the Lord Commander who precedes Jon Snow in that position, is a study in the weight of command over a declining institution. He is not foolish. He understands, with a clarity that his officers often lack, that the real threat is north of the wall, and not the wildlings who occasionally raid across it. He leads ranging parties. He keeps the Watch active and outward-facing in a period when the temptation to become merely defensive, to maintain the wall as a border rather than a watchpost, to turn inward and count stores rather than send scouts north, is enormous. He recognizes something in Jon Snow early, not the full truth of what Jon is, but the military quality of the boy, the capacity for leadership that has been installed by education and native character, and the specific conditions of a bastard boyhood. The having to earn everything, the never being able to coast on inherited position. The ranging north of the wall, into the haunted forest and beyond, into Craster's Keep and the Fist of the First Men. This is where the story of the Night's Watch stops being institutional and starts being existential. What the ranging parties find, and what barely any of them survive long enough to bring back, is the evidence that the texts were right. The others are real. The whites are real. The thing that the Watch was built to address is real, and it has been building in the dark for a very long time, and the political South has been so comprehensively uninterested in the Watch's warnings that the warnings have stopped being issued in any form that carries urgency. Jon Snow witnesses this firsthand. He kills his first white in Mormont's quarters, the fire and the curtain, and the dead man who refuses to stay dead. He understands something in that moment that changes the frame of everything else he understands. The problem is not the wildlings, the problem is not the succession. The problem is not even the decay of the Night's Watch. The problem is what is coming, and everything else is a distraction from it. Stay with me. You are still here, still held, still wrapped in the quiet that this hour provides. Let the breath move slowly, in through the nose and out, and the exhale a little longer than the inhale, the way breathing goes when a body is releasing rather than preparing. We have been following a bloodline south and east, through Valyria, through Rhaegar's books, through a tower in Dorne. But there is another inheritance, one that runs north and deep, and is older in some respects than anything the Dragon Lords produced. Jon Snow is half Targaryen. He is also half Stark, and the Stark blood is not a passive thing, not simply a cultural inheritance. not just the grey eyes and the affinity for cold. The Stark blood connects to something that has been growing in the earth of the north for 10,000 years, something that watches from behind white-barked trees with carved red eyes, something that the maesters of the Citadel have spent centuries politely refusing to take seriously because it does not fit within the parameters of their methodology. Begin with the weirwood trees, because the weirwood trees are where the story of the North's ancient power is most legible. They are pale, bone-white bark, smooth as skin, and cut into their trunks in a pattern so old that no one alive can say with certainty when it was begun, faces, carved in the manner of something between portraiture and accusation, with eyes that weep red sap the colour of old blood. The red leaves overhead filter the light and cast everything below them in a reddish warmth that is difficult to describe without sounding mystical, which is perhaps why the rational tradition of masterly scholarship has so consistently declined to try. The oldest weirwoods predate every human structure in Westeros. They predate the first men who arrived on the continent and found these trees already here, already presided over by the children of the forest. Small, ancient, large-eyed beings who had sung the trees into consciousness over millennia and who used them as a communication network, a memory system, a kind of living library in which every moment that had occurred within sight of a weirwood's carved face was preserved indefinitely. The specifics of this technology, if technology is even remotely the right word, are difficult to convey without the vocabulary of magic, and the vocabulary of magic is one the modern age has mostly dismantled. The children of the forest understood something about the relationship between consciousness and time that the human civilizations which replaced them have lost entirely. A green seer, a person with the particular ability to access what was stored in the weirwood network, could sit beneath one of the trees and enter the roots and move through what had been recorded there the way a reader moves through a library, except that the library contained not text but experience, sensory memory, the actual lived texture of moments from the past, preserved with the fidelity of something that does not decay the way organic memory decays. Bran the Builder walked through this library. The ancient kings of winter, many of them, accessed it. The gift of the Greenseer was not unique to the Stark line, but it had expressed most consistently and most powerfully in the Stark line, for reasons the texts do not explain with any precision, perhaps because of the proximity to Winterfell's heart tree, perhaps because of intermarriage patterns in the early centuries, perhaps because of something in the blood that even the children could not fully account for. It is worth sitting with the scale of what this means. The weirwood network is not a metaphor. It is not a religious symbol, not a cultural tradition, not a romantic attachment to a particular landscape. It is a functional archive of everything that has ever happened within sight of a weirwood's face, going back further than written history, further than oral tradition, further than any record made by human hands. What it preserves about the long night alone, about the specific nature of the others, about the terms under which the first long night was ended, about the magic that was worked at the wall and what it requires to hold, would be more valuable than every book in the Citadel. The Stark Greenseers could access this archive. In theory, a Stark Greenseer alive in the current age could look back across 8,000 years of preserved experience and retrieve everything necessary to understand what is coming and how to face it. Jon Snow does not know he is a Greenseer, or that he might be. The ability, like so many things in his story, is something he carries as potential rather than knowledge. What he does have, from birth, is Ghost, the direwolf, the white one, the quiet one, the one that is different from his siblings' wolves in ways that even the keenest observer would struggle to articulate precisely, but that accumulate into a portrait of something slightly outside the normal range of direwolf behaviour. Ghost is silent. Ghost does not bark. Ghost finds things. Jon, when Jon is lost. Enemies, before enemies announce themselves. Danger, before danger takes a definable form. The bond between them operates at a level below language, below strategy, below the ordinary channels of perception in the way that the best bonds do. Jon slips into Ghost sometimes, in dreams, without fully understanding that this is what he is doing. He experiences the world through other senses, through an animal's unmediated relationship with smell and sound, and the particular vibration of living things moving through snow. This is skin-changing, and it is another gift that runs in the northern blood, though less predictably than green sight, and with less institutional understanding behind it. The free folk beyond the wall know it better than the lords south of it. They have a vocabulary for it, a cultural framework for it, the recognition that some people can slip their consciousness into an animal companion and see and feel through that animal's body. Varamir Sixskins, who rides with Mance Rayder's host, is perhaps the most accomplished skin changer alive in the age of the story. But the ability did not originate with the free folk. It is older. It is another thing that runs in the Stark blood, manifesting differently in different individuals, expressing most completely in those with the deepest Greenseer gift but present in attenuated forms in the broader bloodline. What Jon carries in his northern half, then, is not simply culture or character, though those matter, and we will not dismiss them. He carries a biological connection to the oldest living archive in the known world. He carries the potential, never developed, never trained, never even named to him, to sit beneath a weirwood and ask it what happened 8,000 years ago, and receive an answer. He carries the skin-changing gift, used intuitively in dreams, never consciously employed or understood. He carries what could be called the deep magic of the continent itself, not the fire and blood magic of Valyria, which is newer and more dramatic, but the older, quieter, more fundamental magic of the children of the forest, the magic that was old before the first men arrived, the magic that was built into the bones of the continent alongside the heart trees. The modern echo of this is something Bran Stark eventually reaches and Jon Snow never does, not fully, not in any trained or directed sense. Bran becomes the three-eyed raven, the most complete expression of the Greenseer ability in the current generation, and what Bran finds in the network is everything the story needed, produced at enormous personal cost. But Bran is not Jon. Bran loses himself in the archive, in the way people who consume an experience completely sometimes lose the thread back to themselves. Jon is more firmly rooted in the present tense, in the physical, in the immediate, in the needs of the people directly in front of him. This is not a failure of the gift. It may in fact be a kind of protection. A man who can move between past and present with Bran's facility risks becoming something no longer entirely human. Jon's rootedness, his stark stubbornness, his insistence on the real and the present, keeps him legible to the people around him in a way that a more complete Greenseer might not be. But it also means he never fully understands what he is. He stands between two magical traditions, the fire magic of Valyria and the earth magic of the children of the forest, and he channels both of them through a body and a psychology that was never given the tools to understand either. He acts on instinct. He makes decisions that confound more calculating people, decisions that seem wrong by the arithmetic of the game, and turn out to be right by some other metric, some larger frame, some accounting system that includes variables no one else is measuring. He does this without knowing he is doing it. He does it the way a bird navigates, not from a map, but from something older and more reliable than maps. Let that image carry you. A bird in flight, navigating by something it cannot name, the earth dark and cold below, the stars above cold and old and indifferent, and between them, the small warm thing that moves with confidence through space that it has never mapped, toward a destination it has never been told, because the destination was encoded into it before the journey began. Your breathing is slow, the night is generous with its time, and the weirwoods stand in their groves, their red eyes open, watching everything, forgetting nothing, waiting. The direwolves found at the beginning of the story, 5 living pups and 1 dead, in a tableau that the keener minds in the party read immediately as significant, are themselves a message from the old magic, a signal from the deep biology of the continent. Direwolves are not supposed to be this far south. They belong beyond the wall, in the forests where the free folk live and the weirwoods grow thickest, in the part of the world that has been given over, by long custom and biological inclination, to things that predate human settlement. Their presence south of the wall is a signal that the boundary is thinning, that the old world is pressing back through into the new, that the careful separation that human civilization has maintained between itself and the deep past is beginning to erode. The Stark children who receive the wolves are receiving not simply pets but familiars, animals that connect them to a heritage older than the Starks as a named house, older than Winterfell as a structure, going back to whatever relationship the first men and their bloodlines had with the living intelligence of the continent. Ghost is white. This is unusual even among direwolves, and the story does not explain it. It simply notes the whiteness as a visual fact, lets it accumulate meaning by association. white like snow, white like the wall, white like the bark of weirwood trees, white like the others, whose cold is the cold that has no warmth in it, the cold that is an absence rather than a temperature. Ghost is the wolf that is different, the wolf that does not bark, the wolf that moves like something already partly in another realm of existence, quietly, without announcement, present and then not present and then present again. His silence is the silence of things that communicate on a register below sound. And his connection to Jon is the connection that runs below speech, below the ordinary channels of companionship, into the place where two different kinds of consciousness find that they share more than biology would predict. Bran Stark's journey north, to the cave of the three-eyed raven, beneath a weirwood tree so old that the boundary between the tree and the man who was once inside it has become unclear, represents the most complete expression of the green seer gift in the current generation. What Bran finds there, sitting beneath the roots and pressing his consciousness into the network, is everything that was recorded in the sight of every weirwood that ever had a carved face, going back further than the histories written by human hands. He sees the making of the first White Walker. He sees the pact between the first men and the children of the forest, the agreement to stop cutting down the weirwood groves in exchange for peace, an agreement that held for 4,000 years and whose significance the current age has entirely forgotten. He sees Ned Stark, young and frightened, cleaning his sword in the courtyard of the Red Keep, speaking to a statue, speaking to the absence of what had been his family, while somewhere above him, on the steps of the Great Sept, something irrevocable was being decided. The network holds all of it. The network is the memory of the world, and Jon Snow, who has the blood that could access it, who has the heritage that could make use of it, goes north instead, away from the cave, away from the archive, toward the kind of cold that has nothing to tell you and everything to take. Let the weight of your body surrender fully to what holds it. The mattress, the pillow, the blanket. These things have been holding you all along, and they will continue to hold you without any assistance. You do not need to manage the holding. You can simply be held. And let the voice be part of the holding. Another layer, another warmth, another presence in the dark that asks nothing of you except the loosest form of attention. We are going deeper now, into territory that sits at the intersection of religion and cosmology, and the kind of prophecy that is not really about predicting the future so much as it is about shaping the present through the weight of expectation. The prophecy of Azor Ahai is very old, older than the Targaryens, older probably than Valyria. It lives in the religious tradition of the Lord of Light, in the red temples of Essos, in the mouths of red priests and priestesses who speak it, with the urgency of people who have decided that urgency is the appropriate response to what they know. The Lord of Light, R'hllor in the original tongue, is a deity of fire and light and contrast, a god whose cosmology is organized around the opposition between warmth and cold, between life and death, between the flames that illuminate and the darkness that swallows. The religion is not gentle. Its central claim is that the world is a war between two forces, that the darkness is not metaphorical but literal and advancing, and that the Lord of Light has been preparing, across centuries of divine intention, a champion who will fight the darkness at its peak and either defeat it or fail and let everything end. This champion is Azor Ahai reborn. The original Azor Ahai lived in the Age of Heroes, approximately 4,000 years after the Long Night, or alternatively in the Long Night itself. The dates are disputed, the timeline is contested, the scholarly tradition within the Red Priesthood has produced some of the most intricate and contradictory annotations in the history of religious thought. What the prophecy says in its core formulation is this: the champion will be born again amidst salt and smoke, beneath a bleeding star. The champion will wake sleeping dragons from stone. The champion will draw the sword Lightbringer, a sword that was forged, according to the original legend, at extraordinary personal cost, quenched in the heart of a beloved person, carrying both the light of the stars and the grief of that sacrifice in its blade. And the champion will drive back the darkness. The darkness, in the context of the story we are following, is the others, the White Walkers, the Night King and his army of the risen dead, the Long Night returning after 8,000 years of its absence. This is what Melisandre believes. The Red Woman, the priestess of R'hllor who attaches herself to Stannis Baratheon with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting for the right vessel, and is not entirely sure she has found it. She's a believer in the deeper sense, not in the casual, culturally inherited sense that most people mean when they describe themselves as religious, but in the sense of someone who has organised her entire existence around a conviction, who has paid personal costs for it, who has done things she knows to be wrong in service of what she believes to be right. She is dangerous, in the way that sincere believers are always dangerous. She acts on faith rather than evidence, and faith does not update the way evidence updates. She initially believes Stannis is Azor Ahai reborn. This is an error that the story is patient about exposing. It allows her to be wrong for a considerable time, to commit to the wrong vessel with full conviction, to watch the vessel fail in ways that should perhaps have been predictable. Stannis is formidable. He is arguably the most legitimately minded claimant to the Iron Throne in the War of the Five Kings. His claim is cleaner than Robb's, who only wants the North, and cleaner than Renly's, who has the charisma and the following but the wrong birth order. Stannis is a man who understands duty to the point of cold-bloodedness, who has no warmth to spare because he has given all of it to his certainty. He is not Azor Ahai, but he is useful to the story because he gives Melisandre a platform, and because Melisandre, watching him, is increasingly troubled by something she sees in her flames that she does not immediately understand. She sees Jon Snow, not at first, not clearly, but the flames keep returning to him, to the boy at the wall, to the bastard in black, to the figure that her visions circle without landing. She looks for Azor Ahai in the great, and finds herself shown the small. She looks for the champion in the crowned, and finds herself shown the discarded. This is perhaps the most characteristic thing the prophecy does to the people who carry it. It points them away from where they expect to look. The Lord of Light, or the pattern of events that the Red Priests interpret as the Lord of Light, seems to have a preference for instruments that have been shaped by difficulty rather than by privilege, for people who understand loss from the inside rather than in the abstract. The signs attached to Jon Snow when assembled: he was born, not at the moment of, but as the consequence of, salt and smoke. His mother wept in a tower that smelled of blood, the iron salt of it, and there was no fireplace large enough to drive out the Dornish heat. He was born in the last hours of a war that destroyed a dynasty. A star, according to the red comet that crosses the sky at the beginning of the main story's events, bled across the heavens in the period of his central decisions at the Wall. He woke dragons, not literally in the early narrative, but eventually, and in a more personal sense, he woke the dragon in himself, or had it woken for him. He died and was returned. And the sword he carries, the sword that has not yet been identified as Lightbringer, that may never be publicly identified as such, that may be something more metaphorical than an actual blade, may be simply himself, the specific combination of fire and earth and grief and refusal that he represents. It is worth pausing here, at the intersection of prophecy and personhood, and sitting with something uncomfortable. Prophecies are not benign. They do not simply predict, they recruit. The people who believe in them organize their behavior around them, which produces outcomes that the prophecy then appears to have predicted, which confirms the belief, which produces further organizing in a loop that has no obvious exit. Rhaegar believed in the prophecy, and organized his life around it, which produced Jon Snow, which is at least partially responsible for everything that happened to Jon Snow. Melisandre believes in the prophecy, and organizes her service around it, which produces interventions in Jon Snow's life, including eventually the most significant intervention of all. The prophecy does not simply describe the champion, it helps create him through the accumulated pressure of other people's belief, shaping his circumstances in ways he has no control over and no knowledge of. And Jon Snow, characteristically, does not believe in prophecies. This is one of the quiet ironies of his story. The man most likely to be the fulfillment of the most significant prophecy in the world has the least investment in the prophetic tradition of anyone around him. He makes his decisions on the basis of what is in front of him, the people he can see, the threats he can name, the obligations he has explicitly accepted. He does not think in terms of cosmic patterns or divine intention. He thinks in terms of the man to his left and the man to his right and the enemy coming over the rise. This groundedness is both his greatest limitation and his greatest strength. It means he cannot be manipulated by the prophecy the way Rhaegar was. It also means he cannot use it as a source of certainty in the moments when certainty is expensive, and he is poor in it. The stars are very old, the prophecy is very old, and the man at the centre of it is very young and very tired, and standing watch in the cold with a sword at his hip and a white wolf at his heel, and no idea whatsoever that the oldest religious tradition in the known world has been pointing at him for thousands of years. Let that image rest quietly in the dark beside you. There is nothing to solve, nothing to decode. The pattern will become visible in its own time, and for now, the night is enough, and the breathing is enough, and the quiet is enough. Rest. The red comet that crosses the sky in the early period of the main story is interpreted differently by every faction it passes over, which is itself a commentary on the nature of prophecy and the nature of signs. To Daenerys, newly hatched from the fire with 3 dragons behind her, it is the sign of her house, blood and fire, the dragon's breath written across the heavens. To the Lannister court scrambling to manage the aftermath of Robert's death, it is an omen that requires management. To the free folk beyond the wall, for whom the sky is read as carefully as any text, it is a dragon's tale, and dragons mean change, which is sometimes good and sometimes not, but is always significant. Melisandre reads it as the herald of the prince that was promised. She is the only one reading it in explicit relationship to a 12,000-year-old prophecy, which gives her interpretation a specificity the others lack. But specificity and accuracy are not the same quality, and the story is patient about demonstrating this. Thoros of Myr is, in some ways, a more interesting figure in the theology of Rhaegal than Melisandre, precisely because he is less ideologically committed. He is a red priest who has been living in Westeros for years, participating in tournament culture with a burning sword and a convivial personality, not taking any of it very seriously. A lapsed believer, essentially a man who wears the vestments without the conviction. And then he performs the rites over Beric Dondarrion, the Lightning Lord, out of habit rather than faith, and Beric gets up. Not metaphorically, actually gets up. And Thoros, confronted with the undeniable evidence of something he had performed without believing in, is forced to revise his relationship to the faith he had previously worn as costume. He becomes the most sincere believer in the room, not through vision or mystical experience, but through empirical evidence. He performed a thing happened, and intellectual honesty requires that he take the thing seriously. Beric Dondarrion dies and is resurrected 6 times before the main narrative is done with him. Each resurrection takes something. This is consistently described, and the consistency suggests something real rather than rhetorical. He loses memories. He loses the texture of his former life. He becomes less specific, less particular, more archetypal, less the person he was, and more the function he is being kept alive to serve. He is, in a miniature and instructive form, the model for what resurrection costs. And Jon Snow's single resurrection, observed alongside Beric's repeated ones, suggests that the same principle applies, that what came back through that door in Castle Black is Jon Snow but with something altered, something quieted, something that was warm before and is now warm only in the specific circumstances where warming matters and otherwise reserves itself. The Lord of Light does not give without taking. The equation always balances. And what it collected from Jon Snow, in addition to whatever small piece of him stayed on the other side of death, may be the capacity for the ordinary contentment that the people around him can have, and he cannot. You are still here. The dark has not moved, the warmth has not changed, and whatever the mind does in this half-sleeping space, the way it picks up threads and drops them, the way images arrive without explanation and depart without ceremony, that is fine. That is the mind doing exactly what it should. Let it drift. Let the voice be the one fixed point, the light at the end of a long hall, something you can follow without effort. We are going somewhere very specific now, to a specific room in a specific castle, at a specific hour at the hinge of the story. We are going to the moment Jon Snow died, and then, because the story is not done with him, we are going to the moment he came back, and we are going to sit with what those 2 events cost and what they mean, and what the entity that returned him may have wanted in exchange. It happens in the cold. The mutiny at Castle Black is the culmination of a rift that has been building since Jon Snow became Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, a position he arrived at through an election remarkable for its improbability, which itself says something about the way the story keeps pushing him toward roles larger than the ones he seeks. He is Lord Commander of a dying institution that has just received, through his decisions, a reason to die faster. He has opened the gates to the free folk, the wildlings who have been the symbolic enemy of the Watch for generations. He has done this because the mathematics of the coming winter require it. Every person alive on the wrong side of the wall when the long night comes is a body that will rise in service of the dead. The humanitarian and the strategic are, in this case, the same decision. But the Watch does not see mathematics. The Watch sees betrayal. They come for him at night, in the cold, as figures in stories like this always do. The treacherous act performed in darkness, the ambush dressed as ceremony. The thing with knives that ends what the swords could not. Bowen Marsh, the steward, whose face is wet with tears and whose conviction is genuine, which makes it worse. Ollie, the boy, whose grief is also genuine, whose hatred of wildlings was earned rather than inherited, which makes that worse too. They use the word traitor. Jon Snow dies as a traitor to an institution he was trying to save, which is a kind of death the ancient texts would recognise as heroic, and the immediate witnesses experience as justice. He dies in the snow. It is cold. The blood is very red against the white. And then, sometime later, days probably, though the text is not precise about the interval in a way that feels deliberate, he wakes. Melisandre is there, or has been there. Something has been spoken over him in the language of the Lord of Light. The specific mechanics are not described, which is itself meaningful. The resurrection is not explained because explanation is not the point. The point is the fact of it. He died, he was dead, and he came back. And Davos Seaworth, standing outside the room where this happened, hearing the gasp of returned breath, responds with the wonder and horror of a rational man confronting something that should not be possible and is. What the story does carefully is what it does not say about the return. It does not say he is the same. The text and the performance conspire to suggest that something has shifted, that the man who walks out of that room carries himself differently, that the violence he employs at the execution of the mutineers has a quality different from anything he did before his death, more decisive, more closed, the warmth that previously animated his face present now only in specific circumstances and otherwise replaced by something quieter and harder. He says obliquely that whatever was waiting on the other side of death was not the things he had been taught to expect, not the gods of the north, not the warmth of reunited family, nothing, he implies, or something so different from what the living project onto death that nothing is the closest word he has for it. The theological question this raises, and the story is genuinely interested in its theology, even when it does not foreground that interest, is what the Lord of Light collected for this service. Resurrection is not free in any tradition that takes it seriously. The story of the original Lightbringer is a story about what is paid. Azor Ahai drove the blade through the heart of Nissa Nissa, his beloved, and the grief and love of that act went into the sword and made it capable of things steel alone cannot accomplish. Payment is structural in this universe. Magic costs. The resurrection of Jon Snow, performed by a priestess in service of a god, who has demonstrated throughout the narrative that it acts with intention rather than sentiment, this also costs something. What it costs may be the simplest and most devastating thing. It costs him the life he was supposed to have. He walks out of Castle Black. He hands his cloak to Ed Tollett. He says his watch is ended, the specific watch of the Night's Watch, the vow he took in the cold that he is now technically discharged through death, which is the only release the oath allows, but the larger watch, the cosmic watch, the one the prophecy has been preparing him for, that is only beginning. The Lord of Light does not resurrect people so they can retire. Melisandre, watching him walk out, knows this with the certainty that has always been both her greatest attribute and her most dangerous quality. She does not say it. She does not need to. The structure of what has just happened is sufficiently clear to everyone in the room. This is the segment of Jon Snow's story that most clearly reveals his specific danger to every power structure in Westeros. He has now done something no one else in the living world has done. He has died, and the Lord of Light has intervened to return him. He is marked. He carries on his body the evidence of divine investment, the 5 wounds, the scars, and Melisandre carries on her conscience the evidence of having performed something that should not be performable. If this became known, if the lords and ladies of the South, already scrambling to manage the political fallout of Joffrey's death and the war of the 5 kings and the advancing winter, if they were told that the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch had died and been resurrected by a Red Priestess. The political implications alone would be staggering. A man touched by a god is not a man who can be neatly placed in the hierarchy of throne and succession. A man touched by a god is a category the hierarchy has no framework for. If you have been drifting in and out tonight, following the thread and then releasing it and finding it again, that is exactly right. That is the ideal relationship with this kind of narration. If you have found this story worth returning to, worth carrying into sleep and perhaps into whatever thinking the sleeping mind does with the things it has been given, consider subscribing so the next long night has a companion waiting. The stories do not run out. The history of this world goes deeper than any single evening. Jon Snow stands outside Castle Black in the cold, wearing no cloak, looking north. He has been dead. He is alive. He does not know what he is owed or what he owes. He does not know that a god has taken an interest in his survival, or what interest a god takes comes attached to. He knows only that the cold is still cold, that Ghost is still there, that the wall is still standing, and that whatever comes next will require the same quality that everything so far has required. The willingness to stand in the place where no one else is willing to stand, for reasons that will not be universally understood, in service of something that most people are not yet capable of seeing. Sleep now. The watch continues, and the night is very, very long, very. The execution of the mutineers is notable for its efficiency. Jon Snow does it himself, personally, without delegation, without ceremony beyond the minimum required by the justice tradition of the Night's Watch, and when it is over he hands his cloak to Ed Tollett and walks out of Castle Black as if he has somewhere specific to be. The efficiency is not cruelty. He's not lingering, not displaying, not making a theatrical production of the power he is exercising. He's completing a task the same way he completes any task, with the specific quality of attention that his training and his character produce together. Thorough, present, done when done. But the man who walked into the Castle Black yard to take command of a ranging party 2 seasons previously would have had something visible on his face during those hangings. Something that the people watching could read as cost, as the weight of authority, as the recognizable human difficulty of ordering something that causes suffering. The man who walks out afterward has nothing visible on his face. This is not callousness, it is something else. It is what Beric Dondarrion has more of after each resurrection, the capacity to do the necessary thing without being visibly damaged by it. Davos Seaworth's relationship to Jon Snow is one of the story's most quietly realised emotional threads. Davos is a man who operates entirely by a personal code that has no ideology behind it. He does not follow kings because he believes in kings, or because he has reasoned his way to a theory of monarchy. He follows people who he has determined, through extended observation, to be good. He followed Stannis for a long time because he believed Stannis was good, and he watched Stannis make decisions that revised that belief, and the revision hurt him in the specific way that only the disillusionment of a sincere loyalty can hurt. When Davos transfers that loyalty to Jon Snow, it happens without announcement, through the accumulation of small observations. Jon saying what he thinks rather than what is strategic. Jon making decisions that cost him personally in exchange for outcomes that benefit the people around him. Jon failing to keep track of the politics around his own interests, because the interests of the people directly in front of him have displaced the more abstract self-interest that strategy requires. Davos, who has been around self-interested people for his entire career, finds this quality disorienting and then gradually orienting. He organises himself around it. He becomes, in a sense, the political mind that Jon Snow is unwilling to operate with himself. The letter that arrives at Castle Black, Ramsay Bolton's letter, the one that catalogues what he holds and what he threatens and what he demands, is, from a military standpoint, a provocation that invites exactly the response it receives. Jon Snow reads it, and his face does the quiet thing, and then something behind the quiet thing shifts, and he moves. He does not make a speech. He does not consult a council. He makes a decision with the directness of someone who has simplified their relationship to decision-making down to the question of what needs to happen. And then he acts. This is not wisdom, or not only wisdom. It is also a man who has died and come back and found that certain calculations have become simpler on the other side of death. The Game of Thrones runs on the assumption that the players value their own lives, because lives are what the game uses as currency. Jon Snow has demonstrated by the fact of his return that the accounting system he is working with does not treat his life as the primary variable. This makes him, from the perspective of anyone trying to predict or manage him, genuinely and usefully unpredictable. The breath in and the breath out. That is all that is required of you. The body knows what to do in the dark, the chest rises and falls without instruction, the heart keeps its own time without supervision, the mind, if you allow it, loosens its grip on the day and begins to drift in the manner of things that are no longer being controlled. Let it drift. We are going somewhere warm tonight, warmer than the wall, warmer than the cold corridors of Castle Black. We are going to a beach in the north of Dragonstone to a specific morning when something happened that the watching world did not fully understand, and that the man at the centre of it understood even less than the world did, because the world had the benefit of watching from the outside, and he had only the inside, which is always the hardest place from which to grasp the significance of what is occurring. Dragons are not horses. This sounds like an obvious observation, but it is worth making explicitly because the relationship between a dragon and its rider is so consistently described in terms that borrow from the vocabulary of horsemanship, a rider, a mount, a bond, that the differences tend to be obscured. A horse can be broken. The relationship between horse and rider is always, somewhere under the surface of training and mutual habit, a relationship in which the will of the larger creature has been suppressed by the will of the smaller one, through repetition and pressure and the specific kind of authority that a human can maintain over an animal of greater physical power, through intelligence and consistency. A dragon cannot be broken. This is not metaphorical. The historical record of the Targaryens includes accounts of attempts to break dragons in the manner of horses, and none of them end well for the person making the attempt. What happens instead is something stranger and more mutual. A dragon chooses, or something happens between a specific person and a specific dragon that constitutes something functionally equivalent to choosing. A recognition, a resonance, a quality of attention that passes between them and either produces the bond or does not. The bond, when it forms, is intimate in a way that the clean word bond barely encompasses. The rider can feel the dragon's emotions in a manner that experienced riders describe as distinct from their own emotional states but present within their consciousness, a second weather system running alongside the first. The dragon in turn responds to the rider's fear and intention with a sensitivity that suggests it is also receiving something, that the transmission goes both ways, that what the Valyrians were preserving in their bloodlines was not simply a key that unlocked the dragon's cooperation, but a particular quality of openness, a permeability, that allowed the two consciousnesses to partially overlap. The three dragons that hatch in fire on the Dothraki plains, Drogon, Rhaegal, Viserion, are named by Daenerys Targaryen after her dead brothers. Rhaegal is named for Rhaegar. This naming is Daenerys' grief given form, her attempt to carry forward the people she lost before she could know them, to make the permanence of their absence into something that continues to live. She does not know, when she names Rhaegal for her eldest brother, that Rhaegar has a living son. She does not know that the son is alive in the world, wearing black standing watch. She does not know that the bond between Rhaegal and Rhaegar's bloodline may be something other than a sentimental coincidence of naming. The first time Jon Snow approaches Rhaegal, on the beach at Dragonstone in a scene that everyone present processes as extraordinary, and that Jon processes primarily as terrifying, what happens is this: the dragon allows it. Rhaegal allows Jon Snow to approach, to touch, to eventually ride, in a manner that Rhaegal does not extend to anyone else. Drogon is Daenerys' dragon. Drogon has been bonded to her since the fire on the Dothraki plains, and whatever Daenerys is at a deep level, whatever the Targaryen blood means, or what the particular quality of her consciousness makes her to a creature of fire, Drogon recognizes it and responds to it absolutely. Rhaegal, floating nearby, watching Jon Snow approach with the stillness that large things reserve for moments of assessment, does something that Drogon does not do with strangers. He waits, he looks, and he allows. This is the dragon confirming what the text has been building toward for the entire narrative. The Targaryen bloodline is not simply a political claim, it is a biological and perhaps metaphysical reality, and the dragons are the most precise instruments available for detecting it. Rhaegal is named for a father he never met, and he bonds with the son of that father and the naming and the bonding come together in a moment of convergence that the story offers without underlining, trusting the weight of its own accumulated evidence to do the work. Jon Snow does not know, in this moment on the beach, that he is Rhaegar's son. Daenerys does not know it. Rhaegal's acceptance is evidence before the evidence is in hand. The dragon is telling the story that the people are still catching up to. What it felt like from inside the experience is something the text gestures at rather than describes, the cold of the dragon's initial breath, which is not actually cold, but which the anticipation of death makes the body experience as cold, and then the warmth of the scales as the hand makes contact. A warmth like stone that has been sitting in sun, retained and even, not the live warmth of a mammal, but something older and more patient. And then the movement upward, the terrifying and exhilarating physics of a creature whose wing beats operate on a scale that redefines what the human body is capable of experiencing. And somewhere in that experience, a recognition. Not a thought, not a conclusion, not an insight that can be reported as such. Something more like a door opening inside a building you already knew you were in. Tyrion Lannister, watching from the cliff, processes what he is seeing with the specific quality of attention that Tyrion brings to everything. Thorough, a little awed, already assembling it into a framework. He has told himself, up to this point, that dragons can be approached by people of quality, that the specific exclusivity of the dragon bond is perhaps somewhat overstated by the Targaryen tradition as a piece of dynastic self-promotion. What he sees on that beach revises his assessment in real time. He watches Jon Snow not simply survive the approach, but bond with Rhaegal in a way that is visibly, undeniably something beyond luck or quality, or the particular confidence that brave people project. He watches a dragon choose, and Tyrion's mind, which is the fastest and most honest mind in the room, goes immediately to the question of what it means, which is also the question of what it threatens. The threat is this. A second dragon rider in the narrative collapses the monopoly. Daenerys has organised her entire identity, her entire claim to the throne, her entire understanding of her own purpose, around being the last Targaryen and therefore the only possible bond for the three dragons. If there is a second Targaryen, if the bond that forms on the beach between Jon and Rhaegal is what it appears to be, then the architecture of her singularity is disrupted in a way that is not simply political but personal, in the deepest sense. She has survived everything because she believes she was the last speaker of a language, the last practitioner of an art, the last heir of an unbroken line that ran from Aegon the Conqueror back to Valyria, and perhaps further. And Jon Snow, standing on the beach with snow-grey eyes, and northern manners and absolutely no interest in any throne, has just demonstrated that she is not the last. He is, or he is equally the last. Which is the same disruption by different arithmetic. Let that settle quietly. There is nothing to resolve in it tonight. The beach at Dragonstone is cold and the sea is grey, and the dragons are overhead, very large, moving through air with the confidence of things that have never been afraid of falling. And somewhere in the chemistry of that moment is everything the story has been building toward. Two bloodlines converging, two inheritances meeting, two threads of a story that began in different places and ended up, through the long, improbable work of history, in the same room at the same time. Your breathing is slow, the night is kind, and the dragons are warm if you know how to approach them. Viserion's death above the frozen lake is the point at which the story pivots from the large-scale tragedy of political conflict to the cosmic tragedy of absolute loss. Daenerys has crossed the narrow sea with 3 dragons, creatures that she has spent years nurturing from hatchlings, that she is bonded with in the intimate and specific way that the Valyrian tradition describes, that have become, in the most literal possible sense, the instruments of her power and the emblems of her identity. They are also the closest thing she has to family. When the Night King's spear takes Viserion out of the sky, and Viserion goes into the frozen lake and comes up again later, different, cold, the fire replaced by something that makes fire look harmless. The loss is not just strategic, it is personal in the way that only the death of the irreplaceable is personal. And its reversal, the animation of what was her son, her child, into a weapon against everything she loves, is the cruelest possible version of that loss. The physics of dragonfire versus the Night King's ice magic is one of the places where the story is deliberately opaque, and the opacity is meaningful. The story does not want to render the conflict between fire and ice as a simple contest of elemental powers, each with their established capabilities, reducible to rules. It wants to preserve the quality of the existential, the sense that what is at stake is not a battle that can be analysed and predicted, but an encounter between two aspects of a reality so fundamental that the people within it can barely hold the frame large enough to see both sides at once. Jon Snow, riding Rhaegal into that conflict, is doing something that the entire previous history of his life has been preparation for, in exactly the way that preparation for genuinely unprecedented things works. Not by providing specific training, but by building the quality of character that does not flinch at the unprecedented. He has faced death. He has lived in cold. He has ridden something enormous through sky. None of these experiences individually prepares him for what he is doing, but collectively they build the particular kind of readiness that is less preparation than disposition. The willingness to be where he is, doing what he is doing, without requiring that it makes sense first. Rhaegal's death comes later, and it comes without ceremony. An ambush from Euron Greyjoy's fleet, bolts from a scorpion engine, the dragon falling into the sea before anyone has time to process what is happening. It is the most abrupt loss in the story's final movement, so sudden it feels wrong, and the feeling of wrongness is perhaps intentional. It should feel wrong, because it is wrong, not in the moral sense, but in the structural sense. Rhaegal was the bridge, he was the evidence. He was the dragon that had chosen the man who didn't know he deserved to be chosen, and his loss collapses that evidence before anyone has fully processed what it meant. Jon Snow loses the dragon that accepted him in the same period that the truth of his parentage is creating the fissure between him and Daenerys, and the two losses, the dragon that was his by blood and the relationship that was his by choice, arrive together in the terrible efficiency of a story that does not protect the things that matter. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. Let the thoughts drift through without catching on them. They will be there in the morning. Everything that needs attending will still need attending, but right now the night has made a space between you and all of that, and the space is generous and deep, and does not require you to fill it with anything. Stay in it for a while. The voice will carry you through something that requires careful attention. Not alarm, just attention, the way you might watch a complicated pattern with steady eyes. Because we are going to think now about power, about who holds it and why, and what happens to the architecture of power when a fact enters the room that none of the architecture was built to accommodate. The fact in this case is Jon Snow, and the architecture in this case is the entire political order of Westeros as it existed at the end of the War of the Five Kings. Begin with the Lannisters, because the Lannisters are the family that understands power most clearly and holds it most tightly, in the period when Jon Snow's secret begins to be at risk of exposure. Cersei Lannister, who is in many ways the story's most acute student of power, who has spent her entire adult life studying the mechanisms by which power is obtained and maintained in a society that denied her direct access to it on the basis of her sex. Cersei understands something that the more idealistic players consistently underestimate. Information is not neutral. Information about the succession, information about the legitimacy of a claim, information about a blood relationship that has been hidden. These are weapons, and weapons, once they exist, tend to be used. The threat Jon Snow's existence poses to Cersei is absolute. Not because she personally cares about the Targaryen line, she does not, except as a vector for danger. But she has spent considerable energy ensuring that the story being told about the throne is the story in which her children occupy it, in which the Lannister ascendancy is not an interruption of legitimate Baratheon rule, but a continuation of it. The introduction of a legitimate Targaryen heir, one with a cleaner claim than Robert ever had, since Robert's claim was conquest while Jon's would be blood from the royal line itself, destroys that story. It replaces the current narrative with an older and more legally compelling one. Cersei would not hesitate. She would not deliberate. The information would be classified as a weapon pointing at her children, and she would address it accordingly, with the same methodical thoroughness that she has applied to every other threat to her children's positions. Consider the Tyrells, who are more sophisticated in some respects and less in others. The Tyrell investment is in Margaery's position, queen or queen adjacent, or whatever the current version of proximity to power is. The Tyrells have played the Game of Thrones with more patience and more flexibility than most houses, and their particular flexibility means they can accommodate a change of dominant house more easily than the Lannisters can. But a legitimate Targaryen heir changes the game in a way that flexibility cannot simply adapt to, because it does not just shift the balance of power. It retroactively redefines the rules. If Jon Snow is who he is, then every arrangement made since the end of Robert's rebellion is built on sand. The Tyrell rose grows in sand badly. Consider the Faith of the Seven. The Faith is not a political faction in the obvious sense, but it has been a political force throughout the history of the Seven Kingdoms, and its specific investment is in the legitimacy of the existing order, not because it endorses every element of that order, but because the existing order is the one that gives the Faith its institutional authority. A Targaryen restoration carries complicated religious valences. The Targaryens were never genuinely devout, never fully aligned with the Seven, never comfortable with the Faith's traditional claim to comment on the private lives of kings. Aegon the Conqueror had 2 wives simultaneously, which the Faith found intolerable and eventually compromised on. The relationship between the Targaryen dynasty and the Faith of the Seven was always a negotiated tension rather than a genuine alliance. Jon Snow, arriving at the centre of that tension, is another variable the Faith's political calculus does not immediately know how to integrate. Consider Daenerys herself. This is the most complicated case, and the one the story handles with the most care, because the threat Jon poses to Daenerys is not the threat of an enemy, but of someone she has come to love, which is its own category of disruption, and in some ways the most dangerous. Daenerys has built her entire identity, as we have observed, around being the last Targaryen. She has also built her entire political project around the argument that she is the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, not by conquest only, as Robert's claim was, but by blood, by lineage, by the unbroken descent from Aegon the Conqueror. When the truth about Jon emerges, her claim does not simply have a competitor, it has a superior. In the Westerosi system of succession that prioritizes male heirs, Jon's claim is better than hers, not slightly better. Better in the fundamental way, better in the way that the rules were designed to address, better in the way that everyone who cares about rules will acknowledge even if they prefer a different outcome. This is the thing the story builds toward in its final movement, and it is worth sitting with how genuinely tragic it is. Daenerys came to believe, through years of exile and suffering, and the cultivation of a formidable will, that she was the answer. She endured the deaths of a husband, of an unborn son, of companions, of advisors. She endured all of it on the basis of an identity organized around being the last and therefore the necessary one. And then the person she loves most, the person whose quality of character she recognizes as something rare and trustworthy in a world full of unreliable people, turns out to be the one who makes her unnecessary. Not by any action of his own, not by ambition, simply by existing, simply by being who he is, simply by the fact of his blood and the secret his uncle kept for 20 years. He threatens her not as an opponent, but as a fact, and facts cannot be argued with or seduced or outmaneuvered. They can only be accepted or denied. And then there is the small council, the lords of the realm, the institutional machinery of governance that has spent the years since Robert's death managing one crisis after another, with the tools available to it, which are fundamentally the tools of the existing order, the tools that work within the framework currently in place. A legitimate Targaryen heir is not a crisis the existing tools can manage. He is a reclassification of the entire situation. The War of the Five Kings was fought over the question of who gets to sit on the chair that Robert Baratheon built his reign in. Jon Snow's existence suggests that the question was always somewhat beside the point, that the chair had a prior owner whose claim had never been legitimately extinguished, only violently displaced, and that the displacement and all the suffering it produced and all the wars fought about it were, from a certain perspective, a very long argument about something that had already been decided, somewhere in a tower in Dorne, by a woman dying and a man keeping a promise. What makes Jon uniquely dangerous is precisely what makes him uniquely unsuited to the position the facts of his birth assign him. He does not want it. He has demonstrated repeatedly a pattern of declining or failing to seek the forms of institutional power that his abilities and his situation keep offering him. He became Lord Commander not through campaigning but through an election. He became king in the north not through claiming but through being acclaimed. He could not even manage to consolidate the position before his attention was redirected toward the larger threat. He is a man built for crisis and constitutionally unsuited to administration, a combination that is genuinely dangerous in a sovereign, which is part of why the story refuses him the sovereign's role in the end, and perhaps part of why he is ultimately the right person to be the answer to the Long Night rather than the answer to the Game of Thrones. The night holds all of this without straining. The dark is capacious. There is room in it for the complicated arithmetic of thrones and bloodlines, for the specific tragedy of being necessary without wanting to be, for the particular danger of a man who threatens every faction not through intention, but through existence. Let it all settle, like sediment settling in water when the water is finally still. You do not need to carry any of it. The story carries itself, and the night carries you. Rest now. Varys, the master of whisperers, who has served under multiple kings, and whose loyalty has been directed not at any of them personally, but at the abstract concept of the realm, meaning the ordinary people, the small folk who do not appear in the accounts of battles and succession crises, but who are always the ones who pay for them. Varys is the most explicit voice for the position that Jon Snow's existence changes everything. He says to Tyrion that Jon Snow is better. He does not mean better as a person in the abstract moral sense, though he may believe that too. He means better as a king, better suited to the position, more reliably oriented toward the welfare of the people the position is supposed to serve, more capable of inspiring the specific quality of loyalty that produces stable governance rather than merely enforced compliance. Daenerys, Varys has concluded, has become dangerous in the way that people who have suffered enormously and been proved right about many things and are now very powerful sometimes become dangerous, convinced, righteous, unable to hear the voice of doubt because the voice of doubt has been wrong so many times and the voice of certainty has been right. Sansa Stark's position on Jon's secret represents the most politically intelligent response in the room, which is to say the most uncomfortable one to sit with. She loves her brother, or her cousin, which is information she has now processed with the specific thoroughness that Sansa brings to all unpleasant information, meaning fully and quickly and without the luxury of extended denial. But she also understands, with the political education she has received from Cersei and Littlefinger, and the hard curriculum of having been a pawn in other people's games for years, that information is a weapon, and weapons should be controlled. The information about Jon's parentage, released into the current political environment, does not simply change a succession question. It destabilizes the most powerful military force the living side currently has, the Dragon Queen and her armies, at the exact moment when that force needs to be unified against an existential threat. Sansa's instinct to hold the information, to choose the moment of its deployment, is not betrayal. It is political intelligence. It is also, in the end, something she cannot maintain, because the information spreads with the inevitable quality of all suppressed things, steadily through the cracks in the containment structure until it is everywhere at once. The Unsullied and the Dothraki represent a particularly interesting dimension of Jon Snow's threat to the existing order, because they introduce a non-Westerosi calculation into the mix. They are loyal to Daenerys in a manner that has nothing to do with Westerosi succession law or the conventions of Westerosi lordship. They follow her because she freed the first, and because the second recognised in her the quality of strength they organise their lives around, the quality that is not exactly courage and not exactly ferocity, but the specific gravity of someone who believes in what they are doing with complete conviction. If Jon Snow's claim is introduced into their relationship with Daenerys, it does not resolve the way a Westerosi succession dispute resolves. The Unsullied do not care about birth order or the gendered conventions of inheritance law. They care about the person they serve. The complication his existence introduces is therefore not legal, but personal. It is about what it does to the person they serve, what it does to the quality of conviction that they follow, what it does to Daenerys when the one variable she never accounted for arrives from inside the family rather than outside the walls. We are near the end now. The long corridor of the night has carried us a long way, and if you have slept through portions of it, that is not absence. That is the story doing its work in you without your supervision, which is perhaps the most honest way for a story to operate. Let the breath be slow and even. Let the body be completely still. We have followed a thread from Valyria to the Wall, from an ancient library to a tower in Dorne, from a dying girl's last promise to a boy who grew up believing he was nothing, and we are going to follow it now to where it leads, which is north, which is always north in this story, north past the Wall, north past the cold, north into a landscape so inhospitable that the absence of everything recognizable as human becomes paradoxically a kind of clarity. We are going to the ending, and we're going to think about what it costs to be the person who saves the world, in a world that is not always grateful for having been saved. The long night comes, not as a metaphor, not as a theological abstraction, but as an actual darkness advancing from the north with an army of the dead behind it. The Night King, the first White Walker, the ancient enemy, whatever he is at the most fundamental level, leads a force that has been building since before the story we have been following began, since before Robert's rebellion, since before Rhaegar's obsession, since before anyone alive was born. He brings with him not simply soldiers but a weather system, not simply an army but a philosophy of ending, that the cold is final, that the dead do not suffer, that the peace the darkness offers is the only genuine peace available to creatures who are never going to stop bleeding and losing and grieving if they were permitted to continue. It is a terrible philosophy. It is also not entirely wrong about what living costs, which is perhaps why the story takes it seriously rather than simply making it monstrous. Jon Snow spends the years between his resurrection and the Battle of Winterfell doing what he has always done, trying to convene the living, trying to name the actual threat, trying to get the people who are fighting each other to look north and understand that the thing coming from the north makes their current disputes irrelevant. He does this with the same patient obstinacy that has characterized everything else, the refusal to accept that the small problem is more important than the large one, even when the small problem is right in front of him, and the large one is too enormous to hold in mind. He goes to Daenerys not as a suitor, but as a diplomat, not because he has any interest in the throne, but because she has dragons, and dragons are warm, and warmth is what the Long Night most fears. He kneels not from submission, but from calculation. The calculation of a man who has decided that his pride is worth less than the alliance. The discovery of his parentage arrives into the narrative at the worst possible moment, which is to say, the moment of greatest external pressure, when the dead are literally at the gates, when the survival of the living is being decided in a single night of battle, when the absolute last thing anyone needs is a complication in the political architecture. Sam Tarly tells him, with the blunt goodwill that Sam always brings to things, in the crypts of Winterfell, in the middle of the night before the battle, Jon receives it the way he receives most things that should be shattering, with stillness, with a face that goes very quiet, with the withdrawal into internal processing that the people who know him recognize as his most honest response to things that matter enormously. He tells Daenerys, this is the decision that sits at the center of the story's final tragedy. He tells her because he cannot not tell her. The same quality of principle that made Eddard Stark keep his promise is present in his son, and it will not permit him to know something this significant about himself and conceal it from the person it most affects. The telling is an act of love. The receiving is an act of fear. What passes between them in the aftermath of that conversation is not a failure of feeling, but a collision of two legitimate responses to an impossible situation. His loyalty to truth, her loyalty to survival. The battle is won. This needs to be said with appropriate weight. The battle is won. The thing that Rhaegar believed the world would need, the thing that 12,000 years of history had been building toward, the reason the Wall was built and the Night's Watch was created and the Targaryens preserved their blood across centuries of careful endogamy. It worked. The long night is ended. The dead lie still in the snow. The morning comes. The living survived by the thinnest possible margin, at enormous cost because the right people were in the right place with the right abilities at the right time. This is what the entire architecture of the story produced. A morning after. An ordinary, freezing, devastating, miraculous morning after. And then Jon Snow kills Daenerys Targaryen. We do not have to linger here. The story lingers enough on its own, but we have to name it, because it is the cost of everything, the price the story finally names for the saving. She has burned King's Landing. She has done what people with absolute power and absolute grief and absolute certainty sometimes do. She has resolved the complexity by removing it. The city is ash. The bells were ringing. which was the agreed signal of surrender, and she heard them as inadequate, and she made a decision that cannot be unmade. Jon kills her because she's going to keep going, because the world she's building with fire and blood is not the world the living deserve to inhabit after everything they have already paid. He kills her because Tyrion asks him to, and because he loves her, and because love and necessity arrive at the same conclusion, which is the most harrowing version of clarity available. The Council of Lords and Ladies assembled after makes a decision that is perhaps the most quietly devastating moment in the entire narrative. They exile him. Again. They send him north, back to the wall, back to black, back to the cold, back to the place that was supposed to erase him the first time. This is not cruelty on their part. It is the only political solution that resolves all the competing pressures simultaneously. The Wildlings want him free, the Northern Lords won't tolerate his imprisonment, the Southern Lords won't tolerate a free Targaryen claimant. The exile is the compromise. It is in its way exactly the kind of political solution that the Game of Thrones is good at producing. Technically satisfying, personally devastating, wrong in every sense that the person at the centre of it can feel. He walks through the gate in the wall. Ghost is with him. Tormund is ahead, and behind, the free folk who became his people by the strange alchemy of shared experience and mutual survival. The land north of the wall is not empty in the aftermath of the long night. It is something else, something beginning. Snow-covered and green beneath the snow, alive in the way that things that have been dormant are alive when the particular thing that suppressed them has been removed. The camera, or the prose, or whatever the mind's eye provides in this space. It lingers on his face, and his face does what it always does. It goes quiet, and then something that is not quite a smile and not quite relief moves through it, and he goes north. This is what the most dangerous man in Westeros was given at the end of everything. The north, and a wolf, and a sky that belongs to no one. Not the throne, not the recognition, not even the name, which is still kept in the way that Lyanna intended, kept by a small number of people, not spoken aloud in the corridors of power, returned to the category of things that are true but not useful, things that history knows and politics prefers to forget. He ended the long night, and was sent away for it. He saved the world and was not permitted to stay in it. He was, in the end, the most dangerous man in Westeros not because he wanted power, but because he had earned it through suffering and sacrifice, and the specific quality of character that makes certain people capable of doing the necessary thing, even when the necessary thing costs everything. And that, perhaps, is the oldest story there is. The person the world needs most is rarely the person the world rewards best. The prophesied champion goes north. The winter, for now, is over. The stories will be here when you return to them, and now your watch is ended. If what we explored tonight has settled well in you, if you would carry it into future evenings, subscribe so the next long story finds you when you're ready. Sleep well. Let me know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I'm always curious about that. And if there is a chapter of history or a corner of any world you would like to explore, leave it in the comments. The archive is infinite, and the night, as always, is patient. The council scene that determines Jon Snow's fate is remarkable for its mix of the weighty and the pathetic. The great lords of Westeros and the representatives of their various interests, assembled to decide the fate of the man who killed the queen and the man who ended the long night, and Edmure Tully trying to give a speech, and Sansa's face doing what Sansa's face does when it is making calculations, and not quite managing to hide the making. The decision to exile Jon north of the Wall is reached by the process that produces most decisions in the Game of Thrones, not by the application of any consistent principle, but by the point at which all the competing pressures are equalized. The Unsullied want justice, meaning death. The Northern Lords want freedom, meaning not death. The Wildlings, whose voice Tormund carries, want their own justice, which is that the man who fought beside them belongs with them. The exile satisfies no one fully and everyone partially, which is the characteristic result of political compromise, and which is perhaps why it feels, in the moment of its announcement, like something being done wrong while knowing it is the only possible right. What Jon Snow carries north with him, past the wall and into the land beyond, is not nothing. This is important to say clearly, against the narrative temptation to read his exile as pure loss. He carries his life, which is not a small thing given what it cost to preserve it. He carries Ghost, white and silent and entirely himself, unchanged by any of the events that have changed everything around him. He carries Tormund's friendship, which is the particular friendship of people who have survived things together that no friendship can be said to have preceded, the friendship that comes into existence fully formed in the moment of the ordeal and exists afterward, without requiring the rituals of ordinary connection. He carries the knowledge, even if he has never been comfortable with it, of what he is, the truth about his parents, the truth about his blood, the truth that Lyanna Stark died to protect and Eddard Stark died carrying. He carries all of this north, into a land that does not care about succession or prophecy or the Game of Thrones, into a land where the spring is returning now that the long night is done, where the forest is growing back, and the animals that fled are returning, and the quality of the light on snow is the quality of morning rather than the quality of ending. The story of Westeros does not end with Jon Snow's exile. It continues, in the form of the institutions and the people who remain behind the wall, Sansa's independent north, Bran's council, the slow reconstruction of everything the wars destroyed. But the story of Jon Snow ends where it begins, with cold and quiet and a wolf moving ahead through snow, and the particular quality of a man who has been released from every claim anyone has ever made on him, including the claim of history. He was the most dangerous man in Westeros not because he wanted to be, and not because he tried to be, but because he was the convergence point of everything the world had been building toward for 12,000 years, the fire and the earth, the prophecy and the blood, the secret and the keeping of it, the death and the return. He walked through the gate, and the gate closed behind him. The world he left behind is different because he passed through it. And the world he entered is patient and white and very, very old. Let that image carry you into sleep. The story is complete, the night is generous, and your watch for tonight is ended.